The days following the festive season can be rather bleak, so to inspire myself I've put together this inspiration board inspired by all things vintage ski. These lovely ladies wearing their ski appropriate outfits and staying in a Futuro house on snow powder covered mountains are my idea of heaven. I'm going to be making myself another kitten bonnet. I've made quite a few now from my own pattern, and I'm going to be using some of this really beautiful tweed that I have. I'm also making a skirt out of this at the moment, and I have this lovely vintage ribbon. I actually feel like I should have used a mossy green velvet possibly, or one of the other tweedy colours, but this was what I had, so I'm going to use it. And I'm thinking about embellishing the bonnet with this really beautiful embroidered flower that I got from Liberty London once upon a time. The trim is this Wookiee inspired faux fur trim that you can just buy off the meter, and I'll be lining it in a satin. First thing is to cut out the pattern. I use really good quality paper to print out my patterns so that they're really durable, and it's a close fitting bonnet, but if you want to size it up at all you need to do is add a little extra seam allowance around the top and back seams. It takes only a very little bit of fabric, so great for any scraps that you have. Once you've cut out your outer fabric, you need to transfer the placement markings to line up the trim, and this is how I do it. I just put the pins through the placements on the pattern and carefully pull the pattern off, leaving the pins in your fabric, and then turn over, put pins through going the other way because you have two sides, your left and right side, and then carefully separate them. Alternatively, you could use tailor's tacks if you prefer, or another method that works, but this works for me. And then with right sides together, pin around the top and centre back seam, and here you can see the pins carefully pinned through. I then cut out the lining and pin that right sides together, but I leave the top seam open between the notches that are on the pattern. And then I cut out the faux fur trim. This one's quite a thick faux fur, so a bit bouncy, and ideally you would cut out a pattern so that rather than it was on the fold, you'd cut out the whole pattern if you were using such thick faux fur, but I just wanted to do this quickly. And so what I do is I pin it through both layers and I snip through the woven fabric on the back, and I don't snip through the fur, and then I turn it over and do the same on the other side, if that makes sense at all. And that way you don't cut off all the lovely fluffy fur that you want to have on your bonnet. Next step is to sew around the seams on the outer fabric and the lining fabric. If you're using lining fabric that's a really different colour, I'd recommend matching the thread colour and then changing it for the outer. It's a very, very quick sew. And then once I've sewn that, I snip at the corner as I have done here, you can see, and then I snip around that curved seam. There's a notch on the pattern at the base of the bonnet where your neck is, and you need to snip that as well, but don't go over the stitches. And you basically do exactly the same to the lining, and then you press both the outer and the lining to get the seam to lay flat. So you open the seam flat and press it in place. I didn't film that bit of the process for some unknown reason now. I then transfer the placement markings onto the wrong side of the faux fur or trim in exactly the same way as I did on the outer fabric. I carefully pull off the paper, leaving the pins in place, And again, of course, you could use tailor tacks here. I've tried using different tailor chalk and dressmaking pens, etc., pencils, but they don't seem to really work so well for me. And I'm just pinning the faux fur in place just to see what it looks like with the embellishment. And I'm actually really unsure of this now that I can see it. I love the idea of it, but maybe the embellishment's just a bit too big. I think I'm going to have to sleep on it. I prefer it really without, but sometimes you need to step away and give your project a little bit of thought, and then the answer is apparent. So the next day I've decided that the embellishment really doesn't work and I'm going to leave that, and I'll use that really beautiful flower embroidery on another project another time. This is now the trickiest bit. It's matching up the pins on the faux fur with the pins on your outer fabric. So the faux fur and the outer fabric are right sides together, and you have to carefully match the pins so that the trim aligns in the right place. And before you sew the faux fur onto the fabric, it's really important to go over the whole bonnet and make sure that you've taken the pins out, the aligning pins or marker pins. As you can see, I've accidentally left one here. It's very easy to do with all the faux fur confusing things. So make sure that you've taken all of those out before you sew, otherwise you can break your needle. And I'm just double checking that the alignment is okay by flipping the faux fur over and just making sure it butts up to the edge of the outer fabric, just making sure that it all looks good. And the next thing is to sew the faux fur onto the fabric. So what I do is as I'm sewing, I am tucking the faux fur back under onto the right side, just to keep all the fluffles on the side that I want, and any that are caught up in the seam, I just carefully use a pin just to very carefully pull them out and make sure that my faux fur looks really fabulous. And then I flip it the right way. I've already checked that it all lines up, and I just edge stitch it in place. I then place the ties where they go and just stitch them over. And the next thing, which is basically the last step, is to pin the lining to the outer and trim, so it's right sides together, and I mark up the top seam, the centre top seam, and I then pin at both sides where the ties are, and then I also pin at that centre back seam, and then I pin all the rest of the way around, and I know then that it's nicely balanced and it lines up properly. And the instructions tell you what you need to do. So here it is all pinned, ready to sew all the way around. I actually find that if you're using quite thick faux fur, you might want to use possibly a size 14 needle for this bit. I used a size 12 needle for the majority of it, but you may want to change. And then the fun bit is the pulling the bonnet through. So I grab one of the corners where the tie is. I don't pull by the tie just in case. It should be securely sewn in, but I don't chance it just in case. And then I just pull the bonnet all the way through and basically make sure that any of the faux fur is pulled through and the ties are through properly and it's all working as it should. The next step is to sew up the gap that you left in the lining. So I pin it together and then I just hand sew what I suppose you would call a ladder stitch to make sure that that gap is neatly sewn together. And ordinarily this would be basically your bonnet finished, but because I've used quite a thick faux fur trim, what's happening is the lining is rolling through so that you can see it when it's worn. So what I've decided to do here is to pin it and do a hand understitch. So basically I am hand sewing the lining to the seams inside, but I'm not sewing through to the right side. And what this does is it just holds the lining and the seams in place so that they no longer roll. And then my kitten bonnet is ready to wear, whether I am hanging out on the smartest skiing slopes and ski resorts in the world, or just walking along the very windy seafront here in Hastings. I really love my kitten bonnet because it keeps my ears lovely and warm. If you have enjoyed this video and would like to know more about the kitten bonnet, I have linked this below. I have it as a PDF pattern or a paper pattern like the one I've used in this video, and I also have a kit of this in a lovely vintage leopard blush faux fur. Thank you so much for spending time with me in my little cottage by the sea while I sew this vintage inspired bonnet. It's a love it or loathe it thing, and I just absolutely love my kitten bonnet. If you've enjoyed this vintage sewing episode, then please feel free to subscribe, and I will see you next time, my lovelies. Take care.